Good morning, Dora. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning. I can hear you and see you.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you too, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
So far, so good.
Yeah, it's always good to be a little early.
Hi, guys. We can see and hear you just fine. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Becky. How are you?
Good. How are you, Maury?
Doing well.
Good. Good to see you, Tom. It's been a long time.
It's been a while, Becky.
Good morning, Maury.
Hi, Kathy. How are you?
Good. Have a good weekend?
I did.
Great. I'm going to just test share screen, make sure I can pull up my
Hey guys,
again.
that was a redirect journey. I got redirected, I think, 3 different sites.
Me too.
Did anybody else have that?
Yeah,
Okay.
I did
I
too.
was-
And there's
I was a little
a
concerned.
moment of panic. Yep, me too. Me too. But we're here. All right. Does that look okay, everybody?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. And I think we're already recording here. So
Thank you all for joining. Appreciate it very, very much.
yeah,
yes,
Becky, thank you. Thanks for
Yeah,
your
you bet.
coordination and getting us in order.
No problem. We'll get going here in about 8 minutes or so.
I think we're
Good.
just expecting one more presenter. I think Kathleen Stacks is going to join us.
Perfect.
So, okay.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think we ended up sending the presentation link to Emily as well, which is fine. She'll be on mute, I'm sure, but good to have her if we need her.
I sent it along to Mark as well, just in case. I'm not sure if we'll see him or not, but
Hi, this is Stephanie from PUC. You said Kathleen will be presenting. Will she need permissions to share her screen as well?
no, I think Maury, she's just verbal, right? She doesn't have any slides.
Kathleen?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's just some introductory remarks. She is the chair of the CETA Board of Directors, and so she just wants to kick things off.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
By the way, Maury, while we have a couple minutes to kill, I looked at that microgrids study. There's nothing in there.
Okay.
There's literally nothing we could have used.
Okay.
It's like, oh, there's going to be a forecast of microgrids in Colorado or something, and like, I'll have to say we should have coordinated and used that. No, that doesn't exist. So Tom, I'm targeting a handoff to you at 9:25. That is my goal. I was going to text you that, but I thought I'd just tell you.
Then I'll hand it back at 9:30.
Sure.
A minute per slide. So I 9:25, and we have 1 hour. We don't want to allow somebody might have to keep me on track.
Tom, I can play timekeeper. So you want to hand it back at 9:30, you said?
No, that was a joke.
I was hoping that was a joke. Okay, good. What time? 9:50?
9:50 at the latest, I would guess. Yeah,
Okay. I will chat you at 9:45. How's that?
great.
Chat or text?
You guys want to leave us some time to ask questions, so please.
Looks like all three commissioners are on now, but I do not see Kathleen yet. So we've got a few minutes here. Okay, Mr. Chairman, I think whenever you're ready, at 9 o'clock, we've got everyone that is intended to be here now.
Thank you. Good morning. This is the Commissioners' information meeting regarding the CETA transmission studies. I don't know, Maury, or you want to get us started?
Thank you, Chairman Blank. I'm going to hand things off to Kathleen Stacks. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Morning, Commissioners and PUC staff. Thanks for having us this morning. I'm Kathleen Stacks. I'm the chair of the Colorado Electric Transmission Authority, or CETA. CETA is the, CETA was created in 2021 to facilitate the expansion of the electricity. It's a lot this morning. It's a mouthful. The electric
It's
transmission.
not that early.
Still a lot of words. It's Monday, you know.
Fair enough.
So CETA was created by statute in 2021 to facilitate the expansion of the electric transmission system to enable Colorado to meet its clean energy goals. It's an independent public body with its authority vested in a board of directors. CETA is not an agency of state government, and it's not subject to administrative direction by any commission, board, or agency of the state. And with that brief introduction of CETA, I'm going to pass it back to Maury Galbraith, the Executive Director of CETA.
Thank you, Kathleen. Good morning, Commissioners. For the record, I'm Maury Galbraith. I'm the Executive Director at the Colorado Electric Transmission Authority. In 2023, the state of Colorado directed CETA to study the need for expanded transmission capacity in the state. The study that we are to conduct is to address whether and how the expanded capacity will support the forecasted demand for electricity in the state, support the state's emissions reduction goals, improve the flow of electricity on the transmission system, and improve overall grid reliability. The study is also to consider the ability to expand transmission capacity through the construction of new transmission lines, through improvements to existing transmission lines, and through connections to organized wholesale electricity markets. To conduct this study, CETA conducted a request for proposals from consultants, and we ultimately hired Energy Strategies to complete the study. We have completed the study and are here today to present the findings and results to the Commission. And now I would like to introduce Keegan Moyer, who is a principal at Energy Strategies, and he's going to walk you through the details of the study. Off to you, Keegan.
Thanks, Maury. And thanks to the commissioners for giving us some time here today to talk through this. I'm gonna start the presentation with some opening remarks and then share with the other presenters. So if you can jump to the next slide. This is our initial report. There will be some subsequent materials that I'll talk about later, but to touch on some of the items that Maury just mentioned related to the project team. So Energy Strategies was the prime contractor that led the response to the RFP and was selected by CETA. We also had a team of hand-picked, kind of purpose-made subcontractors taking on specific areas of a project. Gridworks, a lot of you probably know Kathy was the lead facilitator and supported us with our stakeholder engagement. Transco Energy, based out of Arizona, supported us with some of the power system and reliability modeling efforts, and Montana Mountain Energy, led by their principal, Emily Leslie, assisted us with the geospatial analysis required for the study. So here's some background on CETA, and today's presenters include Maury, who you just heard from, myself. I'm a principal at Energy Strategies, and then Tom Green, a director at Energy Strategies, whom many of you may be familiar with from his years of planning experience in Colorado. And then also Kathy will be covering a slide or two on the stakeholder process. So let's move forward. So this is the outline of the presentation we have prepared for you today. We have about 55 more minutes, and I know Chairman Blank, we wanted to have enough time for some Q&A, so we are going to move through this expediently. but also stop at certain points to focus on the core issues. So the majority of the presentation, after we get through some of the background and purpose and some of the process we went through, is going to focus on the key results and findings, as well as the transmission portfolios that the study identified. There's an array of appendices we've provided. In addition to the materials here, there's a lot of the stakeholder presentations that Kathy will touch on that's available on the CETA website, and as well as meeting summaries and some of the future reports I'll mention. So there's plenty of materials out there beyond those, what we're able to present today. So with that, we'll jump on in. So as Maury mentioned, this study, the premise of it was really to respond to some legislation, SB 2316, directing CETA to perform this study. There's several critical components, all of which are going to be highlighted today to some degree. So first, a critical component of the study was the stakeholder engagement process. So we engaged stakeholders through a series of meetings and comments to really garner their input on modeling assumptions and the scenario analyses that we performed. Another key step was to embed and consider utility and independent transmission plans and project portfolios in Colorado. So that was effectively an input into the work, which was a holistic transmission capacity study. And then the main outcome of this analysis was what's characterized in the RFP and our deliverables as a gap analysis. And so what we were trying to accomplish was to look out the 20 years at potential transmission portfolios and transmission roadmaps and identify, what sets of projects may be needed that are not already under development. So this presentation is a summary of what's called an initial report for the study. That report will be released in September. The purpose of that report is to summarize the stakeholder process, provide the results of the gap analysis, and provide some detail on the transmission portfolios that we arrived at, and offer some of the initial findings. One of the main purposes of that report and the stakeholder comments we're going to request is to really ask stakeholders how CETA should interpret the findings of this study. So as Maury mentioned, there's a lot of things you can do with the transmission analysis framework. The primary purpose of this framework was to look at transmission expansion opportunities that would, one, help ensure the state meets its demand for electricity. Two, help the state ensure that it meets its emission reduction goals. And three and four, improve flows and reliability of the system. So let's go to the next slide here, Kathy. Thank you. The reason I'm showing this slide here is more to demonstrate what the study is not doing versus what it is doing. And one of the reasons for that is that, there's this role for CETA and role for this study. We want to be sure that it's not perceived or directly encroaching on other activities. So first and foremost, this study is not a replacement for transmission analyses performed as a part of an ERP. It's not a state-sponsored resource planning activity, although we do develop a resource plan, and it's not a endorsement of any particular project. It's a review of basically transmission portfolios and transmission roadmaps. It is not a construction plan for the state of Colorado, right? It's not a statewide transmission plan that's intended to result in a direct approval of any individual project. It doesn't embed any permitting, siting, or cost allocation work. And it's not trying to pick winners and losers, so to speak, in terms of selecting individual project portfolios. And so along those veins, we're not trying to undermine any ongoing or prior utility planning efforts. We really tried to construct and position this project to be additive to that work. So the study is focused on two planning horizons. There's a 10 and 20-year horizon. The focus, of course, was on the longer range horizon. And the goal was to identify transmission gaps that may impact Colorado's ability to meet its loads, integrate new resources and benefit from interregional power exchanges. So I am now on slide 4. Kathy, there we go. And I'm going to hand it off to Kathy to touch briefly on some of the process we went through with stakeholders to accomplish this.
Thank you, Keegan. Good morning, commissioners and PUC staff and those listening in. So from the outset of this project, stakeholder engagement was recognized as a core principle for the study. And in fact, it was highlighted as a very important principle for the project. So GridWorks was hired as a subcontractor to facilitate this engagement. The team hosted 4 meetings with stakeholders just about monthly for the first half of 2024. And during those meetings, we were careful to reserve time for Q&A and to pace them so that stakeholders had opportunities to weigh in. And then we also requested written feedback after each of these meetings and welcomed informal dialogue and exchange between the meetings. The first of these was February 9th, where the study team introduced the study methodology and the reference case assumptions, and also introduced a new concept for the state, busbar mapping, to really take the forecasted generation down to the substation level. So transmission needs that were anticipated could be anticipated with more precision. So 46 stakeholders attended that meeting from approximately 30 organizations, and we received 6 written sets of comments after that meeting. Then March 22nd, our second meeting, we reviewed the methodology. It's pretty dense to make sure that folks understood and had a good grounding and comprehension of how the study was going to work. We reviewed the study progress at that point, and then spent quite a bit of time talking through study scenarios for the various stakeholders to really zero in on what were the stressors to the system that would be best to focus for scenarios. We had 54 stakeholders there, approximately 40 organizations, and received 7 written comments after that round. Then in April, the team released a busbar mapping proposal by email to really zero in on this new process and make sure that folks understood it. And we had the study inputs as accurate as possible. We circulated that to approximately 100 contacts on our distro list, and then quite a bit of informal exchange back and forth on among engineers to really zero in and get the study inputs as strong as possible. Meeting 3 then was May 24th. We reviewed the reliability results and brought back the results from the proposed scenarios and discussed solutions with stakeholders. We had about 40 folks at that meeting from 30 organizations and received 11 written comments after that. Then meeting 4, July 26th, so just a month ago, reviewed the production cost model results and discussed top expansion opportunities. So you'll hear most of that today. At that final meeting, we had 51 stakeholders from over 48 organizations. And for that one, we did lay over the initial comments just in anticipation of the initial report and another open comment period after that initial report. So all this is to say that we had a very intentional process to front load the stakeholder engagement so that folks had opportunities to weigh in and guide us as the study progressed. And like Keegan said, all the materials are available on the CEDAR website. Thank you. I'll hand it back to Keegan.
Thanks, Kathy. And so the next couple slides is what we have time for today in terms of covering the methodology. I'd love to spend an hour just on this because we iterated and I think innovated a lot with stakeholders in terms of the ability to do this type of statewide study. And so we've had to boil that down here into a 5-step study process, which I'll explain and then kind of after that highlight some of the key assumptions embedded in this that really were the main drivers of transmission expansion. And then I'll touch on the study findings before we start showing you some of these transmission portfolios. So the primary input into the study was a forecast of load and resource trajectories. Today, those are still the primary drivers of transmission expansion. So for this study, we leveraged a model called Resolve, which is a capacity expansion model. The model that we used, we received and coordinated with the Colorado Energy Office that was previously used for a Colorado greenhouse gas reduction roadmap. So for those of you tracking model lineage, it was a Colorado model built by E3, which we obtained and made some updates to, reflecting changes in resource costs and plans made since that prior study was done. So one of the fundamental traits of this model that it captures, as it really captures two things: a trajectory of load, out over 20 years. Our reference load forecast is consistent with utility ERP forecasts. And it also embeds in this the approximately 10 gigawatts of incremental generation that is planned for in Colorado per those ERPs. So that resource forecast is really locked in and kind of baked into our study. So a big part of the study becomes, what is needed in addition to this from a resource perspective, because the primary purpose of the transmission that we're looking at in this study is to, enable flows across the system, which is primarily moving resources to loads, right? And the study forecasts in our reference case an additional need for about 15 gigawatts of new generation. So that is a total of approximately 25 gigawatts of incremental generation that is forecasted to be needed by 2045 to meet carbon reduction goals, service the state's loads, and reliably meet the system peak. So basically provide sufficient resource adequacy. So that 15 gigawatts of generation was in addition to what's in the ERPs. Consistent with that, we also, in terms of assessing the transmission need, which is the next step of the study, an important input into that was all of the state's planned infrastructure for the 10-year time frame. So, for example, the Colorado Power Pathway, a series of investments being developed right now by Tri-State, amongst other upgrades, totaling roughly $2 billion in cost. That's a loose figure, but the assessment accounted for all of those planned pieces of transmission infrastructure. And so the study really became about our transmission analyses that we did subsequent to those factors I just listed. We analyzed the need for transmission using three primary study techniques. The first study technique was focused on deliverability. So the ability to move resources and resource pockets into load pockets during times of system stress, which is really, we need these resources for resource adequacy. Do we have the transmission sufficient to move them into those load zones during those critical hours? That's the first type of study. The next type of study is more of a traditional reliability analysis, is what many planners might call it. A heavy summer kind of peak demand condition with a more moderate view of the system in terms of resource output, taking many more contingencies and looking at system performance holistically. And then the third type of study we did looked at remaining congestion on the system after all those reliability issues have been addressed. So is there lines that we can add that would improve the economic performance, meaning the economic dispatch of the system? So that was the transmission assessment. In response to that assessment, we developed a transmission portfolio. So this transmission portfolio represents transmission investment above and beyond what is planned. For our reference case, which Tom will speak to shortly, we identified a portfolio of roughly $4.5 billion of incremental transmission investment over the approaching 20 years. That portfolio is made up of roughly 550 miles of new or greenfield transmission and over 3,000 miles of reconductoring and rebuilding of transmission. So one of the key components of the study was to consider how we can repurpose and build from the existing grid we had. As Tom will talk about in a bit, one of the key strategies was to do just that, right? Much of the state's transmission need can be met with the existing system. It just has to be rebuilt and reconductored. One of the other components of the study was to explore the potential use of advanced transmission technologies. So this includes high capacity conductors. It includes, storage as a transmission asset, dynamic line ratings, the classical list of, new technologies that are emerging that can be used to meet these long range issues. So what the study found primarily is, aside from some of the advanced conductors, which were applicable to some of the portfolios and the lines in the portfolios, we found that for the most part, most of the advanced transmission technologies were not sufficient due to the magnitude of need explored in this study. And so what we found is that generally when we look out 20 years, the severity of the grid violations and the overloads and the need for new line capacity is so significant that the marginal grid enhancement and grid performance benefits of some of those technologies is not technically feasible as a solution. And so because of that, the study ended up identifying portfolios made of new lines and primarily reconductor lines, rebuilt lines, and high capacity conductor lines. In addition, when we did have the opportunity, there was a very sophisticated geospatial analysis taking into account environmental sensitivities as well as the difficulty of constructing on different types of terrain and existing rights-of-way to help us route and explore feasible geospatial paths for some of these lines, and that impacted our cost estimating exercise. The primary purpose of a scenario analysis that took place after the transmission portfolios were developed was to look at how the base portfolio of expansion projects might need to change to respond to a different future. So we looked at a series of portfolios. One of the main portfolios that we looked at was a high demand portfolio where it's forecasted that Colorado's economy would electrify and see significant new point loads in form of data center or fuel production. And then there was another scenario that we focused on regional integration, where we looked at how the transmission topology might need to change into response to, for example, more wind coming from SPP and or different market constructs in the West. One of the things that we identified from these, I don't have time to touch on all these findings here, was that we identified a interstate transmission portfolio that would enhance Colorado's ability to exchange power with neighboring states. That portfolio, is made up of 3 projects primarily and has an estimated cost of about $750 million that increases connectivity to Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. One of the final components of the study that I mentioned, kind of closing things out here, was a transmission gap analysis. So we looked at these portfolios we identified and attempted to really help CETA prioritize by looking at where the largest gaps were. In our view, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, a lot of the reconductoring projects and the rebuilding projects, those don't represent as significant a gap depending on your view of the grid, because they can be done with expanded right-of-way, which is still difficult to do in some cases, but is maybe more feasible. So the gap analysis we focused on for CETA is really the nature of some of the greenfield and new lines that we identified. So what we tried to do with this study is to generate information really directed at CETA that would position the organization to be able to respond to, prioritize, understand transmission proposals and partnership opportunities that were being brought forth. The example that I've been using is that some of these portfolios contain lines and new concepts, and developers and utilities may be seeking to partner with you, CETA, on lines and projects that look very similar to those. So what CETA has now is an independent view of what the state might need over 20 years. And I would say that all else being equal amongst 2 proposals, a proposal that aligns with this portfolio, this roadmap for the state, CETA might ultimately prioritize over one that perhaps doesn't or was not identified in the study. So that's an example of how we anticipate CETA might be able to use this work and use it to take action. So go to the next slide. That's the overview of the study process. Here's some of the critical drivers of the outcomes. So the transmission portfolios we identified were very sensitive to the location of resources. That's not unique to the CETA study. That is pretty much the case for any transmission analysis you do, especially on a long-range basis where there's lots of resources being added. So the problem statement we had here, which was that we forecasted a need for about 15 gigawatts of additional generation above and beyond what's in the ERPs, we needed to develop a perspective on where that might land. So first of all, we received excellent stakeholder engagement during this phase of the study, and we're able to iterate with stakeholders, including the Colorado utilities in some circumstances, on where it was most reasonable to site some of these resources for study purposes. The second thing I want to highlight is the level of sophistication applied, I think was unique to Colorado. So we applied a busbar mapping analysis that took a perspective of, broad state resource needs and cited that need at a busbar level based off of many technical factors, including the commercial interest. So who had shown interest in developing in this area, the hosting capacity of one region over another. We were able to do some independent studies and say, hey, let's bias the siting of these resources to areas where there was existing grid capacity. We were able to look at land constraints, issues like slope and restrictions on development in certain areas impacted our view of how many resources we could put there. Of course, we took into account resource quality, and then also, as I mentioned, a detailed assessment of the transmission system in terms of where areas were maybe more or less ripe for interconnecting these resources, as well as some stakeholder feedback that allowed us to iterate on this. This was one of the things that got a lot of eyes and was a big driver of the results. Another important driver you would expect is the demand forecast. So that's shown here. I'm showing and highlighting two of the forecasts that we use, the reference case forecast, which effectively aligns with the ERPs, and then the high demand scenario. All that I'll spend time noting here is that the high demand scenario ended up resulting in about 2 times as much transmission being built. So what we learned is that the Colorado transmission system is very sensitive to the materialization of loads in the state. Go to the next slide, and I will touch on some findings, and then we'll jump into the portfolio. So all these findings are supported by the portfolios you're going to see in the next slides. And I'm going to hand it over to Tom here momentarily. But these are the main takeaways. We wanted to share these first. So first of all, what the study found is that Colorado faces a significant long-range transmission development gap that CETA is well positioned to help address. So first of all, we identified what I mentioned, the incremental $4.5 billion of transmission investment over the approaching 20 years. Roughly 44% of this investment is in the form of greenfield or new lines, right? However, that definitely does not make up the bulk of the line miles. Roughly 78% of the line miles in that portfolio, and that portfolio is about 3,700 line miles, about 78% of those come from rebuilds and reconductors. So a key strategy for the state, in our view, is capturing the value of that existing right-of-way. That's a really critical component of the state being able to meet its demand and resource and forecasts over the next 20 years. Secondly, we did the 20-year study, and that was the focus, but we did look out 10 years. And what we did is see what I'll call some areas of, with more urgent near-term transmission needs. Those areas are primarily the San Luis Valley, Northeast Colorado, and the Southeast or South Central Colorado areas. We did identify the Denver Metro as another area of concern, but the study, identified some upgrades, but didn't focus on that area. There's a lot of ways to address that issue, and some other utilities in the state are currently looking at that. So not to duplicate efforts, we didn't spend as much time there. So we conclude, though, that near-term expansion of the grid is required to meet the forecast in ERPs. Basically, the Colorado grid needs to have changes made to it in the next 10 years to facilitate the amount of resource and load forecasted in the ERPs. We think an important role for CETA is that there's an apparent need for transmission in the 10-year horizon, but these same areas in the need is exacerbated in the 20-year horizon. So there's significant opportunity for quote unquote right-sizing transmission expansion in these areas so that the builds can be efficient and accommodate further growth into the future. And then finally, this really highlights some of the things we learned from our scenario analysis, is that these plans in Colorado are going to need to be refined and adapted to respond to increases in load and new interstate connections. So first of all, the shortfall in transmission capacity that I mentioned under our reference case grows significantly when we start looking at a high demand future. So basically, the Colorado grid has some work to do to get to the reference case future, but it has even more if it's going to have a electrified economy with a lot of data centers and or fuel production. The other finding that we had is that there are some excellent interstate expansion opportunities out there. We looked at a handful in this study. We didn't have the resources or scope to look as many. And one of the main reasons we didn't do that is because we really had to focus on shoring up this in-state system. So one of our main conclusions is that there's ample interstate opportunities, and a lot of them are going to make sense for the state to invest in. And more work needs to be done to find the optimal set of investments in terms of those interstate upgrades. But those upgrades and the value they generate can only be captured if the proper in-state expansion takes place. And that was the bulk of the 4.5 billion we identified. And so in-state and interstate expansion is critical, and they need to move at the same pace. Go to the next slide. And I will now pass it over to Tom, who's going to talk through the transmission portfolios that we observed and some of the, rationale behind they look the way they do. So off to you now, Tom.
Thanks, Keegan. Good morning, and thanks again, commissioners. So just these next few slides are kind of the punchline, the overall results of what we found. And just to talk a little bit, I may repeat some of what Keegan had said and try not to go over that too much, but just basically where we started, we did start with a 10-year analysis, looking at the system, making sure that we had a good understanding of what the 10-year would look like before we moved on to the 20-year analysis. And as Keegan mentioned, for the 20-year, we did increase the loads and the resources significantly, that 15 gigawatts that we had to add to the system. He touched on, adding resources, and the locations of those is really critical in understanding, where the transmission needs are. Just a little bit on the methodology that we used. We actually did what we call a zonal type analysis, where we broke the state into 9 different zones and evaluated the transmission needs for each of those zones. That's a common practice for understanding how to stress the system and the needs for each of those zones. And then we compiled a list of preliminary projects for each of those zonal type analyses, and then put those all into what we call a reliability case, put those all into one case and did an overall assessment. And then finally, we did a congestion type analysis. And all of those different analyses led to the portfolio that you see here. And as we mentioned, we're looking at a $4.5 billion capital investment for this portfolio. I'll just mention again that this is a plan. It's not the plan, but it's the plan based on the assumptions that we used, which are really good assumptions, with using the bus bar mapping for locating the generation and how we developed that. So as Keegan mentioned, we broke this into, there's the greenfield solutions, the rebuilds, and the reconductor. And a lot of this was based on technical analysis, but also on practical analysis. So for example, as we did our technical analysis, if we could, as we encountered issues, if a reconductor would solve those issues, we would put in a reconductor existing lines. If the issues were so severe that a reconductor would not alleviate those issues, then we would move on towards rebuilding existing lines. And then if that didn't work, then we moved on to adding new transmission. And so those are kind of the buckets there. If you go ahead to the next slide, I like this slide because it shows, in addition to the greenfield and the rebuilds, it also shows the reconductoring. It doesn't pop very much, but if you see the key down below, it gives you an idea of the significant amount of reconductors, as we mentioned, almost 3,000 miles of reconductoring existing lines. So just a few things to point out on here that, some of these elements in the portfolio are relatively obvious. For example, in the San Luis Valley, it's a known issue down there. We know that if we add more resources, we're going to have to, add more transmission in the valley. Not a big surprise. Everybody is aware of the issues in the valley. The southern central Colorado, there's kind of a reliability issue there that exists now and gets worse as you go to 10 to 20 years. So you see lines south of Comanche, kind of a known issue. But if you move into, what we're actually seeing on this map, a couple of things as far as to point out, one of the things we found is that it was really beneficial to tie in the Colorado Power Pathway to the existing system. So it doesn't, really pop out on there, but we ended up tying the CPP to the existing system. And so that was really beneficial for this overall portfolio. Other issues that you see here between Denver area and the Colorado Springs area, that's going to, need some beefing up down there, some new transmission there, and especially out east as you look at bringing resources in from the eastern side of Colorado. You see a lot of lines popping up, not only in northeast Colorado, but also moving that into the metro area. There's also a little bit, on the north side, basically coming down from Tote 7, that St. Vrain area, into the metro area as well. Now, if you move on to the next slide, it really just, this is a list, and just a couple of things to point out from this list. Overall, the greenfield is relatively less than the rebuild. And again, here's some opportunities here that as you go forward, these could change, but it really points out that in Colorado, it's based on our routing analysis, it's more susceptible to utilizing the existing corridors and doing rebuilds in those corridors versus trying to find new greenfield projects. There's some instances where you just can't do that, where greenfield will be required. And again, this points out the significant amount of rebuilds that we looked at. And there is a line item there for the metro rebuilds. And so a lot of the line items there for the rebuilds, the reconductors, are outside of the metro. But just the metro alone, again, we didn't spend a lot of time trying to find optimal solutions for that, but almost $200 million just in the metro reconductors alone. Just to mention a couple of things about the costs, Monterra does have an optimal cost solution that we utilized, and it takes a lot of things into account. So we started with some basic tools from MISO, really understanding kind of per unit costs, and then using the Monterra optimal costing solutions that takes into account terrain, like forested areas, bodies of water, things like that, and then also takes into account fire risk areas. And so using all that information provides some cost multipliers in some instances to get those costs. So those costs are refined using all of those factors to come with that overall $4.5 billion. So that's, I think, kind of captures the portfolio. I like to talk about the conceptual upgrades because, again, the overall portfolio does depend on the location of resources. And so this gives an idea of alternative segments of the portfolio, as well as alternatives to the portfolio that we laid out. And so I like this map because it shows, especially on the western slope, you see, and all the conceptual lines here are dashed lines. So you see on the western slope, if more resources were developed on the western slope, or if there were additional interstate projects developed around northwest Colorado or southwest Colorado, we started to see the need for beefing up that north-south transmission corridor between Craig and Four Corners. We also found a need for, building in from Rifle to Poncha to help complete that transmission system from east to west. So the conceptual upgrades here, we show this was overall another $4.7 billion in total. And so, we have a whole list of what these would be, but the point is you would not necessarily need all of these, but this is another set of tools in the toolbox that you could rely on should the resource needs change, or should they be developed in different parts of the state. And you see this is about 1,200 miles of new greenfield. And as we'll see through some of the scenarios, some of these conceptual projects would actually be needed depending on the type of scenario. So just going into, some of the other things we heard stakeholders' interest in looking at building interstate, how we might connect Colorado to other parts of the system. We focused on Colorado, and as you see, there's a significant need in the state, but we did some exploration of looking at 3 different types of interstate alternatives. One was in the northwest side of the state, looking at connecting the 345 system there around Craig to the Gateway South project. Another was building across the Tote 3 path between Colorado and Wyoming. And another was looking at potentially connecting the southeast part of the state, Lamar, into New Mexico. And so the total of those is $753 million. You see in the pink highlights what each of those projects would cost individually. And so again, we found that these did help alleviate some congestion, especially around Tote 1A and the Tote 3. The portfolio that we developed really does enable these types of interstate projects in the future. But again, it depends on what happens outside of the state. So since we were focused in the state for the 20 years, sometimes it's difficult to really get a feeling for what the benefits might be, especially in New Mexico. We found that, unless the New Mexico system continues to get upgraded, there are not a lot of benefits with tying Colorado and New Mexico, at least at this point. So if you go on to the next slide, here's where we get into the scenarios. And this is where things really got interesting. And we looked at the high demand scenario. Keegan touched on this. This was a 50% load increase over the reference portfolio. And so, again, this could be due to higher electrification of the system, more load centers. But, just from an engineering perspective, creating a 20-year model has its challenges. Adding even more load on top of that creates even more challenges. So we found that we really needed to do a lot of additional reconductoring to the system and add a lot of additional transmission just to get this case to work. So if you see here, kind of the bottom line here is about another $4 billion on top of what we had for the reference case, just for this high demand scenario. Again, to Keegan's point, that the system really is dependent on the load growth, and what is required, will depend on that load growth trajectory and what is seen. A couple of things to point out here is that you do see the Western Slope transmission system being needed that we showed as conceptual earlier on. But as you add this additional load, we did find the need for that transmission system across the north to south and on the Western Slope, and from the west to the east across that Rifle to Poncha to Front Range lines as well. And then lastly, we looked at a scenario that was accommodating SPP wind. So it was a regional type integration. And we looked at 3 alternatives in this case. And this was bringing wind from the eastern part of the grid, which isn't connected to the west, into Colorado. And we looked at 3 alternatives. One was putting 2 gigawatts into Lamar. One was 1 gigawatt at Lamar, 1 gigawatt at Burlington, and the last one was 1 gigawatt at Lamar and 1 gigawatt at Sydney. Just to point out that we did not evaluate what would be required for infrastructure just to make that happen, to increase the DC ties to make that happen. This was just assuming that we could actually get that into the grid here. And so this was the lowest cost alternative out of those 3. It was, another $95 million just for bumping up that infrastructure to get that into the Lamar area. And really what that required was some additional infrastructure between Lamar and the Pueblo area, and beefing up again, some of that infrastructure right around Lamar. So I know I covered a lot of material really fast, but that kind of describes the portfolio and the transmission system in a nutshell for the reference and the scenarios that we looked at.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to try to wrap up quickly so we can get to hopefully some questions. So this is what's to come. So there'll be a initial report I mentioned that's going to come out in mid-September. It's going to focus on basically what you saw today, a written version of this. The main thrust of that is, how, what advice do we all have for CETA on how to interpret this? It's really complex. There's a lot to do there. The final deliverable is a final report that'll be published no later than the end of January next year. I think we'd like to have it done before that, but that's going to have a full technical report and a summary. The technical report will, focus more on the study process, the stuff that we didn't have time to get to today as much, and all the detailed assumptions that we work through with stakeholders and really have already been reviewed and shared. It's really just getting that all written up. And then we'll also have an enhanced version of this initial report showing what we heard from stakeholders on what CETA should do. And then there's a final presentation to the Colorado legislature. I believe that's a committee level presentation, I think. Yep. So final slide here. We've been asked to keep track of what we could do better. I think ultimately, just for context, we did this in about 6 months, 6.5 months, pausing for I think four or five really key interactions with stakeholders. So it was an ambitious study that we didn't have flexibility in terms of a timeline. And to be frank, the contractor budget, this was all legislatively mandated, so we didn't really have any flexibility. And so because of that, we kept track of a lot of things that we learned and would flag for future consideration. So I'll run through these really quickly. I don't want to take away from the questions too much, but this is important. So first of all, additional work is needed to really identify the optimal set of interstate upgrades. We found our hands a little bit tied due to the state level scope of this. So we did learn right away that there's some issues, downstream in neighboring states. For example, the issue that Tom mentioned in New Mexico that would require more utility to utility, state to state coordination than what we had kind of framed up in the study. And that was important. So stakeholders were really interested in this topic. We really wanted to do a bunch. We needed to shore up the in-state transmission system, and we did that, and we got to some of this interstate work, and we think it's going to be really valuable. But we also know that there's other work going on. 2 studies that I want to point out, Connected West, which is a study actually led by GridWorks, and then the Western Power Pool's West Tech effort. These are all interregional, interstate studies just by nature. So there's no doubt to me that Colorado will have information that it can glean from those as well. Another thought on future work is the consultants and the stakeholders agreed that more time and resources to dedicate to scenario analysis would be helpful. That's really the tool in transmission planning to address risk and uncertainty. And so we had to pick a set of scenarios at the end of the day. We couldn't do them all. We want to do more. There were a lot of really good ideas. And there's a request for more assessments of what does it look like with more connectivity to SPP? What does it look like with higher levels of DERs than we had included? All of these are important issues, but not ones that we were able to spend as much time on as we would like. Another key issue is the capacity expansion model. We didn't have time to build a whole new model for this study that was tailor-made for every transmission nuance. So we had to move forward with a very accurate and good depiction of state level planning, but having a model that we can embed more transmission constraints into and explore some of those resource transmission trade-offs earlier on in the study would have been great. That would have also helped with some of the other issues around DERs that stakeholders were asking for. Another thought is that we had great stakeholder engagement, but we didn't really have the time to sit down with utility specific groups. So we would have loved to have more time to, for example, engage with CCPG's conceptual working group was a group that's explored these types of issues before, having more time to have meetings with them versus having to have our stakeholder meetings and kind of keep going with the study. Having more places to stop in the future would be nice. And then also, this study was really oriented around what the legislature asked, which is, the portfolios to meet the demand, to meet the carbon reduction requirements, improve reliability and flows on the grid. There's lots of things you can do with transmission analysis, and we weren't able to do them all. And finally, there's been a lot of interest. We've had asks, hey, is this going to be updated? We do think there's a lot of value in recurring analyses, because what you learn is that the investments that are most robust and needed are the ones that keep showing up as you change assumptions, change views of the future. They're persistent in their nature, and it's hard to do a study on a one-time basis and say it's good for the next 20 years. That's not really the way that a lot of this planning is set up to work. Is you revisit them, you update the assumptions, and the best investments rise to the top. So with that, I'll stop. And we left some time, not as much as we might have liked, but we do have a little bit of time for questions.
Appreciate it. Appreciate it. Maybe we can go a little long. I just want to start out with one comment and then maybe two quick questions. The comment is just greatly appreciate the work that's been done here. It's fantastic to see, and given some of the challenges we've had with statewide transmission planning and the far bigger problems with West Connect and regional planning, just really happy to see this work. So thank you. The question is, do you have, a little more color on where you're at with the utilities? And I'm wondering if there's anything this commission can do, maybe later in September or October to schedule, maybe a half-day information meeting, particularly with the jurisdictional utilities, and see if we can't move the conversation more towards a common understanding of what needs to be done. And then I'll just throw out my second question, which is, have you guys also looked at a low load growth scenario? If we got like 1,000 megawatts of VPPs with storage in the Denver metro area, what would that do? You're talking about $8 billion worth of new transmission. And I'd love to see what would happen if we got, like I say, 1,000 megawatts of VPPs with storage, a dispatchable resource in the Denver metro area, whether that would sort of limit it. So with the hope that maybe we can go a little past the top of the hour, be curious about, how you oriented to the utilities and whether a half day or a day long sim in September or October could help that conversation.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's just more conversation with us. So I'll stop there, Kathleen, Maury, Keegan.
Yeah, Maury, maybe you could take the first question and I'll answer the second one first. Does that sound good?
That sounds good.
Okay, so on the VPPs, DER, so the study did capture in this reference case a pretty aggressive trajectory. We had, I think, just less than 2 gigawatts of distributed resources, so around 1.7 gigawatts. So they were embedded to some extent. And so this issue of, what happens if that number would be greater? You mentioned a gigawatt or so, Commissioner. So our view is that it would certainly avoid some of the transmission that we identified in this study, right, in that reference case. So a good way to think about that is that, if we had a gigawatt and a half or 2 gigawatts, if we were able to have those resources, there's a strong argument that the incremental resources we modeled, the 15 gigawatts, that might drop down to 14 gigawatts, or it might drop down to 13 gigawatts. It definitely doesn't go down to 5. There's not a world where 1 gigawatt of distributed resources displaces 10 gigawatts of utility scale resources. That's not how the physics or the math works. So what our conclusion has been so far is that it would avoid, one or more series of these investments, probably the most expensive or the most difficult one. We're not really sure which one that is yet. And we don't have a recommendation around that other than to recognize that upward trajectories in the DER forecast generates a downward trajectory and the resources and load that we see, which would push down the level of transmission investment marginally, but we don't think it would obviously eliminate it all together. And Maury, maybe you can take that.
I'd just say one more thing on that, which is if you do have an alternative scenario analysis, it would help us put an avoided cost on it. I'll just throw that out there. And why don't you go, Maury? And it may be small, but in VPP world, it wouldn't be small. So
totally.
Anyway, Maury,
yeah.
Why don't you take the second question about process utility relationships and whether it's worth trying to do like a half-day meeting or a full-day meeting in late September or October.
Yeah, so we've had really good engagement from both XL, Tri-State, and several other utilities from the get-go. Kathy summarized some of that stakeholder engagement in her part of the presentation. We are planning on putting out an initial report that focuses on these key findings and key results, and we're interested in getting written responses. And so I'm hoping that those same utilities will react to the portfolios that we've presented and give us their thoughts on those. And we were hoping to do that in the mid-September timeframe. So a workshop with the utilities might help with that, right? It might help focus the response. We might be able to answer some questions and get an even better response. So we're open to that idea. I think it would be great. And then what CETA really needs to get out of this effort is this is an awful lot of investment, right? CETA cannot possibly take on all of this. We need to think about criteria for prioritizing projects that CETA wants to pursue. And so, as Keegan mentioned, that's one of the things we're going to be asking the stakeholders to provide us input on is, should we be focused more on the new builds, less on the reconductors? Should we be focused on some of the interstate proposals that are in there, or should we be focused on some of the in-state efforts? We're interested in what criteria the CETA board should use to prioritize these projects. And so getting that input from the utilities and stakeholders would be really important to CETA as well. So lots of reasons to hold a workshop and get input.
Commissioner Gilman, why don't you go next, since I think you got a hard stop at the top of the hour.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks. And I don't mind if you all continue, but I do have to move on to another meeting. Perhaps just another question, but another plug. I think as we continue to evaluate, the value of deep demand response and VPP integration in Colorado, it's important for us to look across all the streams. And so to the extent to which in the future, we can understand the value here, I think that would be really helpful. A question on the regional integration scenario. As I understand it, the costs you present didn't include the actual cost of the DC ties themselves, and wondered what it would take to kind of understand the value of those and who would be likely to pay and what kind of proportion for development of such an upgrade.
Yeah, in terms of developing the cost estimates, our understanding is that there's a sophisticated engineering analysis around the equipment that would need to be expanded in those, and that's not kind of within the scope of our traditional, I guess, simplified infrastructure cost forecasting tools. So it would involve engagement with some type of vendor, and then the owners of that equipment would be the ones that would be best positioned to look at, their decision to upgrade that. I know that those entities have explored through, I think there might have been a CCPG or a West Tech or a West Connect group at the DC Ties working group or something like that. But we didn't, develop any trajectories on those costs as a part of this study.
Any follow-up questions, Commissioner Gilman? Looks like you only got a minute left. So
no, not right now. Thank you. I really appreciate the presentation.
Commissioner Plant.
Thank you, and thanks for this this briefing. This has really been interesting and educational, Maury. I don't know if there's been a report since 2010 on the on transmission needs, and I remember the work you did on those reports. But I did have a couple of questions just to also add to what my colleague said in the interest around the demand side, and recognizing that the high demand scenario is almost entirely, if not entirely, comprised of resources that would be controllable. I think it's probably a significant component of that that incremental difference. I do have some questions about some of the different cases and how they maybe cross over or don't cross over. I think we had 4.7 billion in the conceptual and 3.8 billion in the high demand scenario. I didn't know if those are basically subsets of one another, or if they're completely different, addressing completely different components of the transmission system or objectives. So that was one question. Also, and this goes to something more just maybe referred to in terms of a future CIM, but I'm wondering how the staging of this happens. For example, I think you had about 78-80% of your miles in the base scenario was reconductoring, only 28% or so of the cost. I'm just wondering how that relates to capacity. Is this a 28% investment where we can meet most of the capacity that's generated through the basic transmission plan, or is it more of I'm not sure how miles relates to capacity as it relates also to the budget. So I was wondering if there is any information on that. And finally, going back to that crossover issue, you had about a $95 million investment from, assuming an upgrade in the Eastern Interconnect around Lamar coming in towards Pueblo. That $95 million investment in capacity upgrade. You also had, I think, in both the conceptual and in the scenario that looked at regional investments, something connecting Lamar down more towards the southern part of Colorado, maybe Trinidad area or something. To what extent does the increase in capacity going to Pueblo address, getting into that regional market to the south, as opposed to building that line? I think there was the Longhorn something line that connected down, and then there was also a conceptual line, I think, that connected those two areas. To what extent can we address that, maybe that southern interconnection with that $95 million upgrade for the SPP connection?
I'm not sure I can keep track of all those in my head, Commissioner. Tom, can you help with the you Commissioner Plant, Tom Green? Can you take the last one, Tom, and then I'll think about the other ones that I was able to note down here.
I can take a shot. Okay. So the 95 million was, again, that was focused on Colorado. So I think the question has to do with, could there be some benefits to doing all of those things? Really, what we were looking at was just an additional injection into Lamar and what would be needed in Colorado to accommodate that. So that was the additional 95, was just some additional beefing up of the transmission between Lamar and Pueblo. Now back to I think the question had to do with the interstate, the Longhorn down into New Mexico versus, I think on the conceptual, we showed a dash line from Lamar down into New Mexico. That's just kind of an alternate, I guess, alternatives as far as getting transmission into New Mexico. In the conceptual piece, it was more of an alternative to help solve the issue that we saw between Comanche in New Mexico. That's kind of an existing condition. So we're looking at, well, if we built from Lamar down to Gladstone, would that help that? And the answer is yes. Would that also be a potential interstate project? Yes, that could alleviate the Longhorn to New Mexico line or be a replacement for that. But if the plan is to go ahead and build as part of CPP a line down to Longhorn, well, then it's a much shorter line to get from that southern piece of Colorado down into New Mexico. Not sure if that answers completely what you're looking for, but the 95 million was really just beefing up the transmission for additional injection into Lamar.
Okay, so that wouldn't accommodating a higher capacity maybe going down into New Mexico. It would just be specifically for our demand.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And then I think there was one other question on what the conceptual list of projects is relative to the reference portfolio. And the conceptual list is not a portfolio, right? It's not really intended to represent a scenario where all those pieces would be built. We did a significant amount of sensitivity work. One of the ways we did the sensitivity work is we looked at if more or less resources are built in certain areas, how might we change the investments we identified? And all that sensitivity work really led into that list of conceptual projects. So really it's a menu of replacement options, really, that could jump into a different portfolio depending on the future that actually transpires. So we kind of knew that all this was going to change and evolve, and we had to do a lot of sensitivities to do that, but we still had to peg in a reference portfolio, as you learned. So the conceptual list really captures a bunch of alternative options.
Yeah, and thank you. And the other question that I had was how we had reconductoring was about 78% of miles, 28% of cost. How does it relate to capacity improvements?
Do you have anything to say about that, Tom?
I was thinking about that, and it's hard. I guess it's hard to say how that, if you were to prioritize like the reconductoring over some of the others, if that would really alleviate. I think some of these reconductors, the way we looked at that, these are going to be more generated as normal course of business. Hopefully, as utilities start to do their 10-year planning, they're going to see more and more need for these reconductoring type projects. And so we were just showing those, kind of highlighting those and the magnitude of that, versus we still see the overall portfolio need as being those greenfield and rebuild type projects to really get the capacity. The reconductor just kind of gets you chugging along, but I don't see that they really add a significant amount of capacity compared to the greenfield and rebuild projects.
Great. Thank you.
That being said, I think there's, when Keegan was talking about future work, I think the reconductors are still ripe for additional evaluation in the future to see if there are potentially rebuilds and greenfield and, projects that could be right-sized or newer projects that could reduce that list of reconductors and add to the portfolio. That's just the way the technical analysis went. We're kind of limited to looking at those reconductors versus a complete exploration. But I think it's a good starting place for taking a look at that list. And that's where I think, working with the utilities in the future, having a good understanding of what they see and how some of those solutions that we came up with, they might have ideas about, how they're wanting to skin that cat.
Thank you.
Well, let me just end with a clarification of one of my questions, and then some process. I guess the clarification is, Keegan, I take your point that VPPs by themselves are going to be too small to avoid new transmission. But I just say the current Colorado investor and utility rate base is about $11 billion. And we're talking about something like $8 or $9 billion of additional transmission, which is just a very big number. So as you finalize your report, to the extent whether it's VPPs, demand response, as Commissioner Plant talks about, controllable load, whether it's putting dispatchable resources in the Denver metro area, or reorienting the location of where the generation is located, which I think can have an enormous impact. It'd be really helpful to us to see what much lower load and reoriented generation does to the lines that are ultimately needed. So that's the clarification to the VPP demand response, is just help us to the extent you can understand what we really, really need and what can be handled through alternative actions. And I guess the request to Maury and Kathleen is, would you guys be willing to work with the utilities and our team to see if we can come back sometime in probably early October for a workshop, a CIM, whatever is most productive, to help use this study to build as much of a common understanding as in Colorado as possible. So, Maury, Kathleen, would you be willing to do that?
I think it's a great idea, of course.
Absolutely. I think the board would welcome that opportunity as well.
All right. So again, on behalf of the Colorado PUC, deep appreciation for everything you've done, and with some apologies that this time was so short, but with an offer to really engage a broader dialogue and far more in depth sometime in probably early October, while it's we can still collectively influence and shape the report in whatever way makes the most sense given the scope and budget constraints. So with that, Commissioner Plan or Maury, Commissioner Plan, any final thoughts?
No, just really appreciate the overview. Look forward to the initial report and the discussion that you talked about, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it.
Maury, any final comments, guidance, thoughts for us about how we can help expand the dialogue in Colorado and regionally, and take advantage of all the great work you've done?
I just want to say thank you, Chair Blank. Thank you to the commissioners. Thank you to the commission staff. They were a huge help in setting this up. We're in the business of disseminating these results and getting feedback. So I think a follow-on workshop is a great idea. So we look forward to it.
Hey, thanks all. Sorry for running over. I think the substance warranted it, and more to come. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.